One of the things that Trump promised during the elections is he was going to go after everybody who was a lawbreaker and focus on the criminals. But they started going to court hearings where people were having their immigration hearings to see if they could stay legally. And what that has done is scared the entire community underground, generating exactly the crisis he wanted to stop. We're looking at the Chinese running out of people within 10 years. They now have more people that are 54 and over compared to people who are 53 and under. They've compressed 5 generations of birth rate decline into one generation. And their birth rates have now been so low for so long that even theoretical repopulation is well beyond them. We're pulling out of NATO. We're ending the Fulbright program. We're ending technical cooperation with all of our allies. We're allowing the Russians to run roughshod. We're putting a trade policy in place that is encouraging the Chinese to be predatory in their region. These are all things that when we look back on this in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we're going to be like, well, that was really stupid.
You've said that 2019 was the last great year for the global economy and that the American-led world order is unraveling. And this is a shift made visible today by, Trump's rise maybe and China's looming collapse. But what convinced you that we've crossed that threshold? And how does Trump and China's trajectory fit into this breakdown?
There are really 2 aspects to the argument. The first is more strategic and geopolitical. The Americans created globalization as a way to induce, to bribe everybody to join us during the Cold War. And when we failed to restructure the deal in the aftermath of the Berlin Wall falling, we knew we were on borrowed time. And so we've now had 6 administrations in a row that have refused to really engage on the topic of what we should do now that the Cold War is over and has been over for 30 years. And Trump is certainly the president to crystallize that into policy, the complete lack of a plan. But we were always edging into that. And I identified 2019 as the point where the evolutions and strategic trends in the United States crossed the Rubicon, where other countries now had enough capacity to challenge the U.S. in various parts of the world, but not to impose any sort of order. And so disorder was the only way that we could go from there. And that's certainly been accelerated in the last 6 years. The other half was demographics. When we globalized in the 50s and 60s, everyone started moving into the cities on a global basis. And when you do that, birth rates drop because kids go from being free labor to a cost. Play that forward for 2 generations. And it's not that we're running out of children, it's that we were running out of working aged adults. And 2019 was the year that the last large generation, the boomers, which are a global phenomenon, that was the year that half of them had retired. And so they were taking their consumption with them. They were taking their workforce with them. They were taking their capital with them. And when we reached that tipping point, there was no even theoretical possibility for regenerating the population, the workforce, the capital, and from that, an industrial plant. So we have already moved into a new age, but we have a lot of sliding to do before we get to whatever's next.
Where are these demographic shifts playing the biggest role in shifting power dynamics across the world?
It's happening out on a global basis. There is absolutely no country that has been immune, and no country where the birth rate has slipped below replacement level has ever gotten back above replacement level. Even with the Scandinavians, with all of their efforts to keep their birth rates high by having affordable childcare, they've been able to raise the birth rate a little bit, but nowhere near replacement levels. But the 2 countries that are kind of outliers, one for being so much more extreme positive and one for being so much more extreme negative, are the United States and China. Part of this is by plan. The United States, globalization was a bribe for us. And if we had just invested our economy into the global commons, we wouldn't have been very attractive. So we kept our economy mostly national while everyone else went international, which meant that we industrialized more slowly and we urbanized more slowly. So until very recently, just in the last 3 years, we have had a birth rate significantly higher than everyone else. We have also, until recently, had a immigration rate that is higher than most other countries, which has kept us collectively above that replacement level until just a few years ago. So if we keep aging at our current rate, and if the millennials never have kids, and if we never open our door to immigrants again, we still have until like 2070, 2080 before we're facing a demographic crisis like the Germans or the Japanese are. The other country that is on the other side of this, where the birth rate has just collapsed, is China. Everyone's heard of the one-child policy. That is a part of it, but mostly it's just that this is a country that went through the most rapid urbanization experience in history, and they combined the economic growth of urbanization, just compressed it into a generation. So when the United States industrialized, we did it over the course of a century and a half. And when you build your cities and you run railroads and you run electricity, you get a huge amount of economic growth from that. But for us, it was stretched over 5 generations. The Chinese compressed it into 35 years. That's their growth story. It's not that they're better organized. It's not that they've got a more efficient economy. It's not that they dominate manufacturing. It's that they just took 5 decades of economic growth and compressed it all into 35. Well, you can only do that once, and now that's behind them. And they've compressed 5 generations of birth rate decline into 1 generation. So in 30 years, they went from roughly 6 children per woman to 1. And in the last decade, they've fallen to the point that all of their major cities have birth rates that are less than a quarter of replacement levels. So we're looking at the Chinese running out of people within 10 years. They now have more people that are 54 and over compared to people who are 53 and under. That won't last very long.
I'm sure that this is an unoriginal question, but it's occurring to me for the first time right now. And while in the past, it certainly makes sense to me that you want a young population and a growing young population, is it at all possible that going forward, this could be the opposite of the case? What I have in mind is AI. I mean, you might want to have a smaller population with less mouths to feed if this population is going to be less productive because the work has been displaced.
The Wall-E scenario, where we all just kind of sit around, watch TV. Let's address that from the general approach and then get down to the specifics. So from the general, for that to work, we have to generate a fundamentally new economic model. So the models we have now, corporate fascism, command capitalism, European-style socialism, and capitalism of various flavors, all of those are based on managing the relationships between capital and labor and supply and demand. And to be perfectly blunt, we did not figure out the specifics of any of the 4 of those overnight. We're talking decades, in many cases, centuries of evolution in economic theory and application. Because from the point that you apply one, you never get it right the first time, and there's lots and lots and lots of iterations, and it can be painful. And to be perfectly blunt, we tend to argue about things like this, and we've had more than our share of military conflicts over economic theory. So we would need to invent something fundamentally new. I don't know what that looks like, but if you're talking about a post-scarcity environment where supply just magically appears, that's pretty loosey-goosey once you look at the mechanics. I'm not saying no, because we're talking about something that doesn't exist, but we're not going to get that in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years or 50 years or 100 years, I would guess. Because all of it is based still on materials production, processing, manufacturing, and distribution, and there's limiting factors in all of that. Second, AI, as we understand it today, as we're hoping to understand it 10 years from now, is about information processing more than movement. We are still a significant distance away from having chips that you can put in an autonomous moving system, and that means no distribution. That means you could have static robots that are doing production, but that doesn't help with mining. That doesn't help with processing. That doesn't help with multi-step supply chain, which is how we do all of our manufacturing today, and doesn't help with distribution, servicing, or healthcare. So we need several iterations of AI and many, many more iterations of robotics to get to that point, and we're not close. third, and I think this is going to short circuit this whole discussion, we're not going to be able to do AI at all. The chips that are necessary to do artificial intelligence are all under 7 nanometers, and the ones that show the most promise are under 3 nanometers. Any chip that is under 10 has a supply chain that is the most sophisticated and fragile of any supply chain humans have ever invented. There are 30,000 pieces, there are 100,000 supply chain steps, there are 9,000 companies, and there are over 4,500 single point failures in that system. So if one mid-sized country falls out of the coalition of 80 that are necessary to do these chips, the whole thing stops. And it's not going to restart until we have rebuilt that ecosystem in a new form that is more geopolitically stable and demographically sustainable. And we will not finish that process within 15 years. So I like the AI discussion. I really do. I'm actually kind of thrilled in this country that we're discussing the implications of a technology before it's here. That is not like us. But we've got until at least the 2040s to figure this out.
Just to clarify, so you don't consider ChatGPT to be AI? What do you have?
No, I think it is, but it's early AI, ChatGPT 4.0, which I'm an avid user of. I love the fact that there's a cat in this interview. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the podcat.
The let's see, where was I? I love ChatGPT 4.0, and I think some of the things that we're achieving with AI in terms of programming is great. The way it's displacing people who were semi-information based, things like paralegals and accountants, I think is interesting. I think it's something that we should obviously work on and move the chips as far as we can, as fast as we can. What I'm saying is there's a hard break coming. The chips that we use for AI are graphics processing units. They were designed for gaming consoles. They were not designed for AI, but they can run multiple things in process, and that's why they're good for application for large language models. We have yet to build our first true AI-designed chip. They're hoping to have the designs finished this calendar year. They are hoping to have your first facility in Taiwan making those chips by the end of 2027, and they are hoping to be able to make enough of those chips to start the first true AI data center by the end of 2029. So GPUs are tiny. They're the size of a postage stamp. The ones that are going to be designed to run on the servers are the size of a record, if you remember what a record is, a dinner plate, let's go with dinner plate, and has built-in cooling into it. The idea is that you drop the cost of operating per computation. That's almost certainly not going to happen. And we're not going to be able to continue making our sub 10 nanometer GPUs either. So what's probably going to happen is we're going to fall back to an older generation of semiconductor manufacturer that is not nearly as vulnerable to geopolitical disruptions. But the best chips we can make with those technologies are 14 nanometer. So we get chips that, from our point of view, are several years old, trying to run a current model on, and the processing capacity just isn't there. So where we are today will slip back. We might be able to still do ChatGPT 3.0 or 3.5 where we were about a year ago, but it will take 5 times as many chips to get the same speed, and it'll take 5 times as much power per chip to run it in the first place. So we're looking at like a 90 to 95% reduction in the efficiency of everything we do with AI. And that's a different world.
Speaking of it being nice that we're having this conversation about the implications of a technology that might not really exist yet in the United States, I find it amazing that being someone, I mean, as far as I'm aware, you're not somebody who is a computer scientist or a specialist in AI, but I find it awesome that you know about it in this detail from an
I look for
economics
fracture
perspective.
points, no matter what it happens to be. So, I look at the Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35, and the Defense Department in the same system. It's a weapon system that was designed for a war we're never going to fight, and so it's pointless. AI is designed for a geopolitical environment that is dying. So I don't want to say pointless, but I probably shouldn't have said that about the F-35 either. But it's not designed for the world we're going to be in. And there's a lot of things that fall into that category now.
Could you explain what the F-35
Yeah,
is
sure. So
and
the
why it's called?
F-35 is a fighter jet that was designed in the 90s and the early 2000s. It's now the mainline backbone of the U.S. Air Force and naval projection power. But it was designed for a world where we have a globe-spanning alliance, and not for a world where our alliance structures are breaking. It was designed for a world where long-range drones didn't exist. So it has, from my point of view, insufficient range to carry out its mission. And that's before you consider that we're probably going to be losing basing rights as deglobalization becomes a geopolitical as well as an economic strategy. So if we were to be in a hot war today with either Russia or China, we're not going to use a whole lot of them because they can't reach where they need to go. The standoff distance just isn't there. We're going through a revolution in military affairs, of which long-range drones are just one aspect. We don't know how this is going to play out. So I don't want to denigrate the DoD for putting all their chips in this basket. They had to put them in one basket. We, back in the 90s, knew we needed some sort of fighter jet. And this is what they chose. But we've now invested about $2 trillion into a weapon system that we're really not going to get a lot of use against. You're against somebody like the Taliban, where there's no air defense, it's kind of overkill. And against anyone who does have air defense, it just doesn't have the range to function.
Two things. One, you mentioned immigration a bit earlier, and I'd like to get back to that. But you also just mentioned that you search for fracture points because it's very useful for your forecasting. And one of the fracture points, obviously, that we've been discussing is demographics. And what I find striking about that is I've had many conversations on the show about economics and the future of the United States and the future of China and the world. And somehow nobody has mentioned birth rates. And based on your expression, you're clearly like, wow, how has nobody mentioned birth rates? I'd like to get to the forecasting part and just how do these birth rates affect China, the United States going forward? What does that look like?
Well, first of all, let me make a bit of an excuse for everyone who doesn't follow it. I get it. I mean, demographics don't matter until they do. They move slowly. They move with the speed of a human lifetime, and they just don't matter until they do. It's like a glacier wall. It's there, and then suddenly it lurches forward and you're a smear. And until that happens, you don't care. The issue is that the birth rate decline has now been so long or so low for so long, we're now getting to the point where the cliff wall's right here. And in the next 10 years, Korea, Japan, China, Italy, and Germany, just to name was that 5 of the top 10, all age into obsolescence in this 10-year period where they simply don't have enough workers to maintain what we would consider to be a value-added, modern, industrialized economy. And their birth rates have now been so low for so long that even theoretical repopulation is well beyond them. And there's plenty of other countries that are just behind those 5. In terms of the geopolitical implications of this means a collapse of capitalism in its current form because there cannot be trade if there is not consumption. And there simply are not enough countries where the spending power is high enough and the population of workers is high enough to generate the consumption that is necessary to backstop trade. So we're going to have to develop something different. Now, in the United States and in Mexico, where we have much higher birth rates, we still have the consumption base. And considering that the United States does not have a lot of its economy invested into global trade, we don't have to substitute a whole lot. So the US and the Mexicans together, and obviously Canada is along for the ride, assuming NAFTA holds, means that we get to see how everyone else deals with this before it's a problem here. And hopefully we will learn a few things, even if it's just what not to do.
Speaking of demographics, immigration, Mexico, I think that there are probably going to be a few questions here. But
Always are.
first, yeah, how do the very topical recent deportations, ICE raids in LA, the revocation of student visas all figure into your larger perspective on America's role in the world and deglobalization?
Yeah, so 3 intertwined topics there. First, our role in the world. The United States is in the process of going through a broad spectrum surrender of international power from a military, economic, culture, and strategical point of view. We're pulling out of NATO. We're ending the Fulbright program. We're ending technical cooperation with all of our allies. We're allowing the Russians to run roughshod. We're putting a trade policy in place that is encouraging the Chinese to be predatory in their region. These are all things that when we look back on this in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we're going to be like, well, that was really fucking stupid. Not that I thought all of these things were going to last a long time, but to just pull the cord and walk away is something that for generations we're going to be paying for. Just to pick one example, if you want to project power into the Eastern Hemisphere, you need a place to launch from. And if you end all of your alliances, you now need to do it off the back of a ship like we did for the early days of 9/11 before we convinced Pakistan that they had to be part of our solution. That costs 2 orders of magnitude more per troop on the ground. So now, in order to maintain the military procedures that we have become used to in these last 30 years, we need to increase our defense spending to $5 trillion. That's the only way to make it work. That's idiotic when you could just say base out of Turkey. Okay, so that's kind of step one. That's our very real problem. And there's nothing we can do about this at this point because our political system is offline and Trump can do whatever the hell he wants. And he is. Second, the demographic and the immigration side of things on the high end. The United States has the world's best universities and the world's best research facilities, and Trump is in the process of trying to destroy several of them, with Columbia and Harvard being at the top of the list. The Boston Research Corridor is the most innovative sector of the global system. And if Trump has his way, there will be no international students in Harvard. That's 25% of enrollment. And this has been where the United States basically imports IQ from the rest of the world and has been for well over a century. This is where we have made the greatest concentration of scientific breakthroughs, which has generated on average over $1 trillion of economic activity in the United States every year for 50 years. Breaking that matters hugely. As for what's going on in LA, that's a different basket. We have not had meaningful immigration reform since Reagan. Every time one party tries to work at it, the other party sabotages it for political reasons. The most recent example was the Biden administration trying to do it, and Trump from out of office telling everyone who was a Republican in Congress to vote it down because he didn't want Biden to get a win. Not the first time that has happened, not the only time that has happened, and it's not always been right sabotaging left. We've gone both ways. What that means is that we have an underclass in this society, which based on your numbers is somewhere between 8 and 15 million people that technically, by existing, are illegal. And if you want to enforce the laws as they are currently on the books, activating the National Guard to go after them is a legal option, a legal prerogative for the president. Not saying it's a great idea, but by the book, it's correct. What we need is immigration reform. What we need is a more regularized immigration system that encourages would-be immigrants to cooperate with the legal system rather than try to evade it. And in that, the Trump administration has gone the opposite direction, and not just with this LA stuff. One of the things that Trump promised during the elections is he was going to go after everybody who was a lawbreaker and focus on the criminals. If you treat immigration enforcement as a law issue, then you investigate, you identify the people who have committed the crimes and what those crimes are, and then you go after them one at another. You can do that. But that takes a massive expansion in law enforcement, and each arrest is one person. You cannot deport millions of people that way. You deport hundreds of people that way, and that's what we saw in the first 2 to 3 months of his term. He wanted the numbers. He wanted the splash. So the Trump administration started telling federal law enforcement, so don't go after the criminals anymore. Just go after them, illegal immigrants, wherever they are. So they started going to markets, they started going to churches, and my personal favorite, they started going to court hearings where people were having their immigration hearings to see if they could stay legally and arresting them before they got before the judge because they knew the people had to be there. So they prioritized the people who were socially integrating, who were following the system, and who were trying to follow the law. And what that has done is scared the entire community underground and made them perfect recruits for organized crime of all flavors, generating exactly the crisis that he said he wanted to stop. Dumb, 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 dumb.
Yeah, 3 topics. I have 3 questions. Building off of the last topic and just connecting it to our discussion of demographics, is the main reason that we want a healthy immigrant population and immigration system to make sure that, 1, we have more labor capacity, and also that we have more consumption. You said that those 2 elements are necessary for the preservation of capitalism and trade.
Not just capitalism and fascism and socialism. I mean, all the isms that we understand right now require consumption and production in some sort of balance and some sort of regulation by the government. But yes, if you want to limit the economic transformation, and economic transformations on that level are very disruptive, they shatter the entire political class as a starting point, then yes, you want to keep your population relatively young and relatively productive and have a relatively high consumption base, specifically for capitalism. If we're going to move away from that, if we're going to say lower birth rates are okay and we're going to close the door, then we're going to start aging to a system that's more like China or Germany today, where the only way that they can function is to dump huge volumes of product on the market. Because people under 45 do most of the consumption, people over 45 do most of the savings. And if you shift from a young base system to an older base system, now you've got a more productive workforce, but you no longer have the consumption pace. And in order to avoid social upheaval, the product has to go somewhere. That's part of the problem the Chinese are facing today. So, you basically get to pick your poison. Since the United States historically has been pretty good at assimilating immigrants, we've always found it easier to just maintain a younger population and keep the doors relatively open.
All right, that's topic 1. Topic 2, and this one is quite close to my heart because I'm in the academic world, but it seemed like the revocation of the student visas is very important on your view, mainly because of economic reasons, because we import IQ into the United States, and that, not just that IQ, but what's happening in universities is responsible for, do you say $1 trillion
Not
of
just the universities, but the research institutions that are attached
the
to them as
research
well. Yeah.
institutions? And building off of our discussion of I find AI, even in its current iteration, well, not in its current iteration, but soon to come iterations, very frightening for the prospects of academia and an academic future. And I wonder if AI might just even the playing field across the world to such an extent that it doesn't really matter if the United States has the best IQ anymore, if other countries can just use AI to replicate or improve upon that IQ.
So 2 aspects to the visa thing, and then we'll go into AI and IQ. So the student visas are not so much a demographic issue. The volume isn't enough. I think it's more of a law and order issue. These are people who have followed the process to the letter of the law. And to eject them is to encourage people to not follow the law. And that's going to generate a lot of follow-on problems down the line, not in academia, in everything else. In terms of the infrastructure quality, intellectual infrastructure quality is obviously a bigger issue. Universities don't just hold, they have to continue to plow new fields and make new develops in whatever they happen to be. And we import a lot of talent to help us with that when it comes to science and technology, more so than, say, the social sciences. And getting the best of the world on a regular basis is amazing. The United States has always had the most draw until now. And now all of a sudden the Canadians, the Australians, the Brits are starting to siphon off a lot of that. Whether or not that will prove to hold the test of time is determined by policy and political culture in this country, but I can't say that it's going in a great direction right now. Now, as for AI and IQ, AI in its current form, uh, the breakthroughs that it's making, in my opinion, are not eroding what people can do. So some of the AI that looks most interesting to me is basically doing molecular geometry to, say, find new drugs or new production systems. And that is some fascinating stuff. And we have stalled in the medicine space for quite some time because the amount of time that it takes to develop a new drug molecule is measured in decades now. All the easy stuff is done. And getting a computer to speed that along means that we can focus humans on the more high value added process of producing those molecules and then producing them in mass and packaging them and distributing them and figuring out uses. So from my point of view, AI is a really, really important tool in the scientific sectors right now. I don't see it forcing any jobs away. If you're not in the hard sciences, I can see the concern. If you're going into the social sciences, the ability of AI to aggregate the sum total of human knowledge and history and sociology and law in a very short period of time is really kind of terrifying. I get it. I'm in the process of working on another book, and I have been able to write more in 6 weeks than I normally could in 6 months. Now, I am in a very specialized field that is both incredibly narrow and incredibly broad. And so my bullshit detector is really good, and AI can't fool me. And I know when what it's putting together doesn't cohere. So I'm fine. But if you're more narrow and you don't know what's happening outside of your narrow field, I can see that be a real problem because you can't bring the value added to the connections outside of your field. And if you rely on AI to do it, it's just going to get better and better and better and eventually crowd into your field. Now, I'm not at the point where I would say that we're at a break point, but it's certainly changed the nature of the game. All I can encourage you to think about is think about building a house. You're going to use a hammer. You're going to use a wrench. We're just getting a better hammer and a better wrench. And I'm not seeing the speed in developing AI that I was worried about 2 years ago. So for people who are aware and know more than one thing, AI is really handy. It is not a danger. That might not be true in 5 years, but I don't think we're going to have the chips in 5 years.
This is more of a personal digression, but since you mentioned law, I'm starting law school here at Stanford in the fall, and for mingled professional and academic reasons. And I'm curious if you happen to have thought about or have any insight into what the future of law looks like, the legal profession, given
Well,
AI.
we're talking about broad spectrum economic transformations that will have massive political environment or massive impacts on the political environment. To think that law will not be shifted along with that is silly. What that's going to look like, I don't know. In the short term, paralegals, we probably need 1/10 as many. That is an industry that seems to be custom designed for AI to disrupt. Now, the 1/10 that survive, wow, they're going to be productive. But yeah, don't need as many.
The last thing I want to ask about your most recent response was at the beginning, you mentioned that Trump has no strategy in many ways. And you also said that the United States is pulling back from its military, economic, political dominance that it's historically had on the global stage. And maybe this is an invitation to venture into some armchair psychology. But if there isn't a sophisticated strategy behind this, what do you attribute these moves to?
We've been going through a transformation politically in this country for several years. We have a first past the post single member district system, which is a fancy way of saying that you vote for one person who is going to represent one specific geography and a very specific set of people. You don't vote for an idea, you vote for a guy. And that means that our party system tends to conglomerate into two big tent alliances. But within those tents, the factions that make up the parties rise and fall based on changes in demographics and technology and trade. And in the last 30 years, a lot of shit has gone down. The baby boomers have risen, now they're retiring. We've had the rise of big tech and social media. Globalization has gone hyper, and now it's collapsing. Of course, we're going to handle our politics different. And we're now at a moment, we go through these like once every generation or two, where the factions no longer cohere under those tents, and the tents fall and the factions move around. Some jump sides. We're going through that right now. So the factions that are in play at the moment that used to be firmly aligned with the party, people under 30, the military, fiscal conservatives, law and order conservatives, unions, Hispanics. That is more than enough to scramble everything that we understand. And in moments like these, when the parties are functionally offline, if you have a single charismatic leader, all power goes to him. And so that's where we are. Trump is kind of unique in that in the time he spent out of power, he didn't try to build a political alliance. He destroyed the Republican Party and removed everyone from the institution with any policy knowledge so that no one could ever tell him that he wasn't perhaps the smartest person in the room in each and every topic. And so he came into his second term with the smallest cadre of any American president ever, and he doesn't even have enough allies to staff out the senior staff of the government so that it can function. And in that sort of environment, what he says goes, and everyone else just says, yes, sir. And in the meantime, Congress is a complete mess because the parties no longer function. In that sort of environment, we get some weird policies. And oh boy, howdy, have we had them in the last few months.
While it's on my mind, are you able to disclose what the book you're working on right now is about?
Yeah, I can. I'm almost done, actually. I mean, seriously, 6 weeks. It's been fast. It's going to be a fiction book. My work has always
Oh,
been about how globalization was going to end, how this demographic moment was always going to arrive, and then what happens on the other side. So all my work to this point has been explaining how we got to where we are, how the breakdown is inevitable, and then on the other side of the breakdown, what happens. The
yeah.
stuff in the middle is a mess because all of a sudden a billion different things come into play that didn't come into play before, and I am not smart enough to know the details of how that will go. So fiction.
Okay, well, I mean, this actually perfectly sets me up for where I want to go next. And in The End of the World is just the beginning. You describe a future where piracy returns. I mean, food is a weapon, global trade routes fall apart. And I guess I should just say, I should start by asking, why do you expect this for our viewers and listeners who haven't read the book? And then I guess you're very well prepared to describe what that might look like.
Sure. Details get fuzzy, but the big structure is this. The United States has maintained the global system by using its military to force the global sea lanes to be safe. As technology has evolved, as the American political environment has shifted, as our view of what is security changes, we're abandoning that role, both because of a combination of we no longer want to do it and we no longer can do it. I think a great example of how it's all going to fall apart is what happened in the Red Sea over the last couple of years. The Houthis, whose manufacturing is sharpening sticks, have managed to basically defeat the world's most powerful navy ever in a swath of naval territory the size of Texas consistently because it's just that easy to disrupt shipping now. You have any real country that decides to go after shipping in any volume, and it really is over. So the trade in agriculture, in energy, and intermediate manufacturers, it's going to simply fall apart in the next few years. We've gotten a very good example of how that will happen, even before you start talking about the demographics of a place like China. So you do that. And if you are a country that is dependent upon imports and exports, those imports and exports have to come from a place that can survive this change in circumstance. Now, for the United States, where we're the world's largest energy exporter now, we're in gross terms, not net terms, where we are the world's largest food exporter in gross and net terms, and where our import of product is largely limited to manufactured products that are finished, and you can always remove that industrial capacity. We're the country that has to deal with this the least. And we have the most powerful navy for patrolling the sea lanes that matter to us. Countries on the other side of this, most notably the ones in Northeast Asia, are on the opposite. food importers, raw commodity importers, energy imports, very heavy and intermediate manufactured goods trades, and utterly lacking the naval power that's necessary to patrol their own neighborhoods, much less reach their end consumers. So we get lots of breaks. And as economic activity breaks, naval projection power becomes more constrained, and you get a lot more no man's lands on the water where bad actors like pirates or countries that have decided they can act like pirates will do very, very well. And for smaller countries without naval reach, they're now at the mercy of whatever that new environment happens to be. And unless they can buddy up with a country that is more stable, has more projection capacity, and do things that country's way, they're kind of screwed.
Peter, how did the Houthis manage to disrupt shipping so easily, and why is piracy so easy?
It's a kind of a no man's land. No one can base near there. And it's always been an area where piracy has been strong. Somalia is a really good example of that. But the Iranians basically started providing them with short and mid-range missiles, both cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones. And so if you put people at the end of a supply line for naval operations and expect them to patrol a huge series of territories against somebody who can cook off whatever they want, it really wasn't hard. Part of why global security on the seas has been so easy for so long is all of the countries of the past that were meaningful trading countries, all the trading empires of the past, for the first time in history, we're on the same side. I mean, our Cold War alliance included Britain and Germany and Sweden and Italy and Japan and even China. And so no one had an interest in breaking it down. That's changing. Now, one of the countries that has an interest in breaking it down is the United States. And so we're losing the cooperation that would be necessary to impose security on the water. At the same time, we're losing the interest in imposing security on the water. And countries like Russia have never had an interest in keeping the sea lanes safe. So they're providing missiles to Iran to provide missiles to the Houthis.
So I see how piracy returns on this scale, global trade routes fall apart. And is this then the way that food sort of becomes weaponized because people need it? And if you can disrupt its transport, you can hold countries hostage.
That's one of the ways it'll happen for sure. Thing to keep in mind about agriculture, two things. First of all, in a globalized system where transport is safe, not everyone produces everything they need. They produce what they can earn the most money from. So if you're in New Zealand, for example, you have a cool temperature, warm summers, relatively warm winters, lots of moisture. You could grow wheat for yourself, but that would be a waste of land. So you grow fruit, and then you export the fruit, and you get an order of magnitude more income from that you then use to buy wheat and whatever else you want. That only works so long as trade is free and fair. You remove that, New Zealand will go back to growing the things they need for their own population with less for export. So fewer calories will be produced on a global basis, just as everyone kind of turtles in a little bit. Problem two, there's a supply chain for agriculture. People just seem to forget about that. You need the tractors, you need the equipment, you need the finance, you need the fertilizer, you need the pesticides, and those don't come from everywhere. So if you break down the trading system, not everyone has the ability to access what they need to grow the food in the first place. The United States, North America, is unique, and pretty much all of our pieces are in one place, with the exception of, say, the toxicity stuff for pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. That's a China question. The Chinese produce very little of what they need. They produce their own phosphate, but that's it. They need to import all the rest of their fertilizer. They do make some of their nitrogen fertilizer, but that is from natural gas that is also imported. So you break down these supply lines, and everyone kind of falls from a single globalized market into a series of regional ones, or even national, or even subnational ones. And most of them will not work nearly as efficiently as they do now. For countries like the United States, this is an issue of repositioning, of maybe growing some different things in different areas because the needs have changed and because some export markets have closed. But in huge portions of the world that are just dependent upon the end result of all of that complexity and fragility, you're looking at national oblivion.
How imminent is this sort of situation? What markers do you see today that we're
It's like
coming close.
every day there's like a new little wrinkle. So the Houthi situation is obviously one of the more recent ones that has luckily not gone that direction. When the Ukraine war started, we basically had the world's largest oil seeds producer and exporter and fifth largest wheat producer and exporter vanish from the market for a while. And for a hot minute there, it looked like we were going to lose all the fertilizer out of Russia. That would have killed 1/3 of a billion people over the course of 2 years just from that. But the Europeans then designed their sanctions around that fact. So we've had all of these things hit the system, but we haven't had a mortal blow yet. My concern is that we've gotten really lucky, and I'm very glad for that. And countries like, say, Canada are in the process of increasing the production of, say, potash fertilizer to compensate for the day that they know the Russian stuff goes away. At this point, the Russian stuff hasn't gone away. But we have seen explosions in their fertilizer industry that we've detected from orbit that do not look overly encouraging. So I can't tell you when. I can only tell you how. And the how is everywhere.
Potash is one of those words that I've never heard spoken
It doesn't come
before,
up in
but
law a lot, I would guess. Okay.
yeah, but only read, and I've always thought it was potash. But
It depends
potash
upon who
makes
you
a
are.
lot more
The
sense.
Canadians pronounce things weird, so whatever.
So demographics comes up again, and I can imagine that in this future world where global trade routes fall apart, demography is going to be very important. But you've also written that geography is going to be extremely important in determining national power. How how does that work, and how is it reflected maybe in the two countries we've been talking about the most, China and the United States?
Using geography to understand culture and politics and economics is very old school, pre-World War II. And before World War II was really the only way to understand it. Because before we had globalization and integration, everyone was in some form on their own, and it really mattered what they could do by themselves. And geography has always been the delimiter for that, geography and climate. So if you've got a large chunk of flat land and it rains, you can feed your population. If you have a lot of naturally navigable waterways, you can move product around your system at a very low cost, which will mean you'll have a stronger financial system from the efficiencies that generates. If you've got a coastline that has a good port potential, then you have the opportunity of reaching out to touch someone, whether positive or negative. That means you either have an expeditionary military or a trade network or both. And if you've got barriers between you and your neighbors, whether they're mountains or deserts or oceans, that means you don't have to spend nearly as much on military defense, and you can use it on education or infrastructure or whatever else you want. So having a kind of a gooey center and a crunchy outside, that's what the successful countries of the world have always had. And that's the United States, and that's Britain, and that's France, and to a degree that's Japan, and that's Turkey. And that's why these countries have come up and over and over and over in all of our histories as the powers to watch. Not the political entities that are there, the entities that manifest on those geographies. So the Eastern Roman Empire outlasted Rome by a millennia, and then was taken over by the Turks and became the dominant power for a half a millennia. And Turkey today remains very, very, very powerful. It's not about the people, it's about the place. Until World War II. And with World War II and globalization, the United States said basically, nah, everyone can play now. And for the first time in human history, it didn't matter if you could feed your people, didn't matter if you had good natural infrastructure, didn't matter if your borders sucked and were very easy to invade. You had strategic overwatch from the most powerful country in the world and access to the entire world. So you could import whatever you needed, build whatever you wanted, export whatever you needed. And that's how we got the hyper-globalized system we have today with 200 countries. This will not last. Now, for the United States, we're a country with arguably the best physical geography on the planet. And what we have done since 1945 is sublimate that in favor of the creation of the global community, because the global community worked for us for the Cold War. That community goes away, we fall back on our geography, we look really good. China has arguably some of the worst geography in the world. It's split into different sections that have different political economies. It doesn't have good buffers. It's got a line of islands off its coast, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia. They're called the first island chain, that it has in history never really been able to penetrate through militarily, much less commercially. And it's only because of globalization that they've been able to play, that they've been able to unify, that foreigners have stopped invading them, that they could consolidate politically at home, that they could build an industrial plant and then access the world. That all goes away without globalization. And so they are looking at national destruction before you consider the demographic collapse.
This makes it clear why Taiwan is of such strategic importance.
It's a piece of it. It is part of the first island chain. And if the Chinese could conquer it, then they would have a gap in the chain. Doesn't solve their demographic problem, doesn't solve their global access problem, but at least it would give them a theoretical outlet. If China is to succeed as a power, Taiwan's not enough. It's just one piece. They then have to get the Philippines and Indonesia and Singapore and probably Sri Lanka just to be able to get to the energy sources in the Persian Gulf. So it's like step one of like 37 necessary, but doesn't get them where they need to go.
So demographics and then geography are two of the biggest problems that China has going forward. And
that's my world.
Interestingly enough, I don't hear people talk about it that much when I've had episodes on the show about China's future. Are there other key problems that China is facing, and any that people aren't really talking about as much as you are?
Well, there's a lot. They've expanded their financial sector by a factor of 37 over the course of the last 25 years, which sounds really impressive until you realize that when you double the size of your financial sector, you get a bubble. So from 2000 to 2007, we doubled. We got subprime. We had a recession. Expanding by 37? Are you fucking kidding me? So we're looking at the most overexposed, most over-leveraged economy in relative and absolute terms in human history. That's how you get the ghost cities. That's how you get a real estate system that has over 1 billion spare units. Their agricultural system is the least efficient in the world, in part because there's so much money flowing around. So when this breaks, we have a financial collapse. 70% of private savings is locked up in real estate. So we have a personal savings collapse. That'll trigger a few political problems. We get a famine. Even if international trade lanes remain open, it's like there's no system, part of their system, that is really particularly stable. They've got a very, very large manufacturing sector, but it's not very technologically advanced. They're the king of assembly, and that's an unavoidable step in the process, but it's not enough to make a global empire out of. They just haven't been able to move up the value-added scale, and now because they're running out of people, their labor is no longer cost effective. So Mexican labor is probably about twice as skilled, but is about a third of the cost now.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, they've got the sunk costs. They've got the existing physical plant, but every time someone builds up some replacement physical plant, Mexico, Vietnam, the Chinese are no longer cost competitive. So there's not a lot I hear that's going to persist over the last decade, even if everything else doesn't break.
Okay, their financial sector has grown by 37x. Do you have any forecasts or ideas about what could trigger this bubble to collapse, or is it just going to be a black swan sort of thing?
We're kind of like where the Europeans were in 2006. There were so many systems that were broken that guessing what the proximate trigger was kind of an exercise in futility, because you know that once one of them happened, one of them was enough to bring the whole system down. And the idea that they're not going to be cross-contaminated as these things manifest is kind of silly. That's one of the reasons why I've always loved demographics, because it's so firm. You run out of consumers, you run out of workers, the game is up. And that happens within 8 years now in China. That doesn't mean they have 8 years left. It means we have 8 years for all these other factors to maybe manifest first. But in 8 years, it really is all over.
Right now, seems like the prevailing attitude is that China is just getting stronger and stronger, and it's going to displace the United States as the global superpower. That's not the case on your view. So what should countries be expecting will happen when and if China collapses? How do we prepare for that? And what does the world look like without China as this dominant superpower?
China is the world's largest manufacturing power. They excel at the low end and the assembly point. And one of those things that we miss in this United States is that when a product comes over from China and it shows up in our trade data, and we all get freaked out because it's such a big number, the Chinese are only responsible for maybe 20 to 25% of that. The final stages of assembly, more of the value add happens in the rest of East Asia, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, even Vietnam now. And so the reality of the trade relationship is it's not China, it's Asia. And that's both good and bad. Good in that if we can expand the industrial plant in the rest of the world, most notably in North America, which I think is a great idea, we should probably double it here. Then the China piece, when it breaks away, isn't going to hurt nearly as much. And maybe we can integrate with those other East Asian economies in a way to soften the blow. If we fail to do that, then we're looking at the entire East Asian Rim system breaking, and that will have a far greater impact on us from a consumption point of view, because then none of the productive capacity will exist, and we will have to rebuild the entire supply chain rather than just one or two steps of it. So the solution is build. Under the Biden administration, and this is going to give him more credit than he deserves, we, for the first time since World War II, had what we call industrial policy, where the government takes a step into to build out the industrial plant in certain sectors to achieve national interests. He focused on green technologies. He focused on tech, most notably chip manufacturing. And while I personally could disagree with how he did it in the sectors that he chose, the point is, for the first time in American history, you saw a surge in industrial construction spending. It tripled over his terms, and maybe 1/5 of that is directly credited to the federal government. Since Trump has come in, it's stalled. People are still finishing the projects that they started, but no one is starting anything new. And we need that number to go up as quickly as possible, as high as possible. Because instead of building out to prepare for a China-free future, we're now kind of stalled. And Trump's tariff policies are actually risking bringing the end of China forward before we're ready. So we are going to have a high inflation environment regardless. I would rather have high inflation from industrial production and growth than from a lack of product and us trying to build product when we don't even have the raw materials. So Trump, in my opinion, has put the cart before the horse and is whipping the horse until it dies. That's my biggest challenge. For the rest of the world, it's too late. A country with the United States' labor force and financial capacity has the option of building up this industrial plant. But for the most of the rest of the world, we really bitch in this country about the Chinese industrial expansion and how that has taken jobs and manufacturing capacity away from the United States. And it's not that that's a false story, but they went after the lower value added stuff that, to be perfectly blunt, we had grown beyond and can replace if we really think it's important. But in the developing world, it took everything. The United States manufactures products that no one else can do. We do the best. We're the most productive manufacturing force on the planet. Our workers are so productive that we outproduce the robots. The robots aren't sophisticated enough to take those jobs. But if you're in Brazil, the Chinese came in and set up joint ventures with all of the major Brazilian industrial conglomerates, stole all the technology, took it back home, and then drove every Brazilian industrial firm out of business. And so there is nothing left behind in most of the industrial world. And rebuilding that's a 20-year process. And we don't have 20 years.
What are these products that the United States is making that the world can't match?
We do all of the high-end semiconductor design and implementation. So just to give you one example of how it works. In the United States, you get a company that designs the semiconductor and then works with TSMC to build an instruction booklet on how to produce it, and then sets up the logistics so that all of the parts and all of the high purity components get to the right place at the right time. We basically manage the process from here, and that's the highest value add part of all. For automotive, we build the most high value-added systems that go into it, whether that is the computer systems or the transmissions. In terms of infrastructure, that's a lot less sexy because most of it's not computerized. You're talking steel and concrete, to be perfectly blunt. That's something that anyone can do. It's like, I mean, infrastructure is important. I don't want to say it's not, but a road is a road is a road. There's a reason we don't have a good rail system here. We just don't have the population density to make it economically viable unless you're in the Northeast. But the U.S. economy is kind of funny in that we're bifurcated. We do the high end that no one else can do. We design the systems. We build the monitoring. We do the high-end computer and chip design. And then there's a gap. And then we do the low end because we're an agricultural economy and we have a lot of raw materials. So we grow the corn and the wheat and we process those into products, and we produce the oil and natural gas. And we turn that into chemicals. So we've got these two brackets, the high end and the low end. And then in between the middle ground, that is where we are weak. And to be perfectly blunt, that's where Mexico does really well. So the integration system we have here in North America really is amazing. We just need more.
And I'm not sure if I missed this, but did you say that it was Trump's tariffs that are hastening the decline, that might hasten the decline of China and are thus putting the cart before the horse?
Yeah. So two problems I have with Trump's tariff. I have no problem with tariffs in general. I have no problem with expanding the industrial plant in general. I think that's a reasonable tool for a reasonable goal. Put that to the side. The tariff policies have changed so often. We're now on our 140th since the 20th of January, that industrial construction spending is flatlined because nobody knows what the rules are. And Trump has made it very clear. Let's see, today is June 12th. He's made it very clear there's another 20 tariff policies coming within the next 2 weeks, specifically designed to hit all of our top trading partners. So no one's doing anything. So we had a limited amount of time, maybe 8 years, and we're stopped right now. On the other side, China is the world's most trade-dependent country for imports and exports, and tariffs have gone up and down, and they're about to go up again. That is bringing the end of the Chinese system closer. So we now have less than 8 years, and we're not moving.
Well, for the last few minutes that we have remaining, I'd like to shift to some other countries and maybe the world at large that we haven't touched on yet. And you predicted the decline of Russia well before the Ukraine war began. What do you see going on in Russia today, and what is its trajectory going forward?
Well, the trajectory is a lot harder than it was 3 years ago, but let me try to give you the story. So the Russian geography is awful. They don't have any real strategic barriers like mountains that are close to them. They did in the Soviet system. And so a big part of the logic for the Ukraine war is to get back to a forward position military bulwark that shrinks their functional borders. So right now they've got about 4,000 or 5,000 miles of basically open terrain on their edge. Independent Russia actually has longer external borders than the old Soviet Union did, despite the fact that it lost all that territory. It's just a crook of where the maps were drawn.
Yeah.
But if they can get to the other side of Ukraine and halfway through Poland and through the Baltic republics to the Baltic Sea, then that 4,000 to 5,000 miles shrinks to under 500 miles, and they can rely on geography to help instead of hurt. So this war was always going to happen. It was always going to happen about now, because the Russian demography is awful. It's aging, it's dying. It's not as fast, not as bad as China is anymore. But they were always going to run out of men in their 20s this decade. So it always had to happen in the first half of this decade so that it could be finished by the end of this decade. What's evolved in the last 3 years that underlines that is just the sheer number of casualties the Russians have taken. We're now talking about 1 million men that have either been killed or disabled, and another 1 million men in their 20s who have fled. So if we keep up the current rate of the conflict, the Russians will literally lose sufficient men in their 20s to prosecute the war within 5 years. That assumes nothing changes. Of course, things are dynamic because we're going through a revolution in military affairs, and the way that drones have evolved over the last 3 years is nothing that anyone could have predicted. So this war is very much up for grabs. By the numbers, the Russians have the industrial plant. They're backstopped by the Chinese and the Iranians and the North Koreans. and they're just shoving so much material into the system, and they're expanding their industrial plant for military purposes that is still absolutely their war to lose. But the Ukrainians are not going quietly, and they're proving to be very creative and very innovative, and they are taking these technologies forward as well. So we are in a tech race in two poor countries who correctly believe they have everything to lose. And if the United States were to go into war with Ukraine right now, I'm not sure we would do very well, because already the technology is involved in a direction that we are not prepared for. Same goes for Russia. I don't know. Demographically, the Russian picture is atrocious. They are definitely looking at national dissolution this century. But whether it happens in 20 years or 80 years really matters. And that determines by how this war is going to play out. So I am watching the tech evolve very, very closely, because this is an example of technological breakthroughs that don't seem to be dependent on AI. AI could take it in a new direction, absolutely. But it seems to me that this play can continue forward even if globalization breaks down. And that makes it truly transformative in the long run in a way that we can only now begin to guess at.
Peter, the last thing I will ask for today, and maybe you could just rattle them off because I know we don't have that much time, but are there any really underestimated global flashpoints that you see around us right now that aren't being spoken about?
The world's second most powerful projection-based navy isn't China, it's Japan. And to think that China is going to stumble and Japan will not attempt to take advantage is silly. So there's going to be some sort of naval core conflict in East Asia at some point that we are not ready for, that no one's ready for. Number two, Iran and Saudi Arabia are two countries that hate each other in every possible way. And one of the reasons why there hasn't been a war between them is because the United States has imposed a global security blanket. We're withdrawing that. We're going to have a fight there over the oil fields. That will conservatively endanger 20 million barrels per day of production, 20% of the total. That is more than enough to cause a decade-long energy-induced depression on a global scale that doesn't affect North America. And then finally, we forget that Turkey is a superpower. They just kind of kept to themselves for the last century. They're emerging at a time when Europe is weakening, when the Russians are at war, and when the Arab world is on fire. And whatever form that takes, it's going to be a major power. And to think that it's going to emerge in such a strategic region without a conflict, those are not good betting odds.
Mm. Well, Peter, this has been excellent. You're an excellent speaker and an extremely fascinating thinker. So thank you so much for joining me and doing this.
My pleasure.